We are going to get started. So thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Lily Barraclough, and I am the project coordinator for the Research and Knowledge Initiative here at the New Brunswick Environmental Network. And this is the last webinar in our series, Learning from Connected Communities, an in-depth look at nature-based climate solutions in Atlantic Canada. So bonjour tout le monde, merci pour votre participation aujourd'hui. Nous allons commencer.
Thank you for your participation today. We're going to start our last webinar.
Un examen approfondi des solutions climatiques fondées sur la nature au Canada.
So this is Learning from Connected Communities, an in-depth look at nature-based climate solutions in Atlantic Canada. Sorry. I am Lily Barraclough. I'm repeating my function in French.
And if you would like to hear today's event entirely in English, you can select the globe icon and select English. Si vous voulez écouter ce événement aujourd'hui en français, trouvez le bouton.
Repeating now in French.
French pour écouter la session en français. Before we get started, I want to acknowledge that this work is taking place across the territory of the Mi'kmaq, Wolastoqey, and Passamaquoddy peoples. The New Brunswick Environmental Network office, we are located within Mi'kmaq territory. However, as a provincial organization, we do work across the lands of New Brunswick. And as we talk about adapting to and mitigating climate change, it is especially important to consider the colonial history of the lands that we're living on, as well as the roots of colonialism and the climate crisis. For those of you who are not familiar with us, the New Brunswick Environmental Network, we are a network established in 1991 that acts as a communication network to link over 100 nonprofit environmental organizations in the province. We have a long history of work on nature-based climate solutions. We previously hosted one of the Natural Resources Canada's Building Regional Adaptation Capacity and Expertise project, where we provided training and opportunities for planners and engineers and other professionals in the province on nature-based climate solutions. And we currently are in year 2 of a 2-year project supporting municipalities with building the capacity to implement nature-based climate solutions. As I mentioned, this is our last webinar in a 7-part series learning from communities that have nature-based climate solutions in Atlantic Canada. You can find the recordings of all of our previous webinars on our website and on our YouTube channel. So if you're interested and you missed them, I highly recommend that you check them out. With that, I am going to introduce our 2 speakers today and pass the mic over to them. So we have Roberta, who is the Executive Director of the New Brunswick Chapter of the Canadian Parks and Wilderness Society. And we have Melanie Jellett, who has over a decade's worth of experience working in the environmental sector in New Brunswick and is also a part of the Canadian Parks and Wilderness Society. And they're going to be presenting on protected areas as a nature-based solution to climate change. So I will pass it over to you, Roberta and Melanie, and I look forward to your presentation. We'll be taking questions at the end. So feel free to put questions in the chat as the presentation goes, or save them to the end of the presentation. So thank you so much for being here, and take it away, Roberta and Melanie.
Great, thanks very much, Lily. How's that? Can everyone see the presentation?
That looks great.
Super. Well, hello, everyone, and thank you to Lillian and to the New Brunswick Environmental Network for asking us to take part in this webinar series. We're really pleased to be able to share today about how protected areas can be a nature-based climate solution here in New Brunswick. So, as Lily said, my name is Melanie Jellett, and I am the Conservation Outreach Coordinator with CPAWS New Brunswick, the Canadian Parks and Wilderness Society New Brunswick Chapter, and I'm here with our director, Roberta Clowater.
Hi, I'm Roberta Clowater. I'm the Executive Director of CPAWS New Brunswick, and I'm coming to you from Fredericton in Wolastoqey territory.
CPAWS New Brunswick works on the traditional and unceded territory of the Wabanaki Confederacy, made up of the Willistic, Mi'kmaq, and Passamaquoddy nations. At CPAWS, we strive to listen, learn, and support Indigenous nations in conservation work. This quote on the slide from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which I will just take a moment to read. Reconciliation between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Canadians from an Indigenous perspective also requires reconciliation with the natural world. If human beings resolve problems between themselves but continue to destroy the natural world, then reconciliation remains incomplete. That reconciliation will never occur unless we are also reconciled with the earth. We think that's a really nice way to start this webinar and what we're going to talk about today. We think it's a great reminder that when doing conservation work, about the importance of the natural world for all beings and the need to live in harmony. So for those of you that are unfamiliar with the Canadian Parks and Wilderness Society, we are Canada's only nationwide charity dedicated solely to the protection of our public land, ocean, and fresh water, and encouraging our parks are managed to protect the nature within them. We do this through knowledge-based advocacy, public education, and engagement, as well as collaboration with others like yourselves. We seek to do this in a way that respects the sovereignty and leadership of Indigenous nations. In the past 60 years, nationwide, we've played a lead role in protecting over 500,000 square kilometers. That's an area bigger than New Brunswick, Newfoundland, and Labrador put together. Wow. Our vision is to protect at least half the land, freshwater, and ocean in Canada to sustain nature and people for current and future generations. The New Brunswick chapter, which has been active since 2004, has led campaigns that have allowed us to reach 10% of the province in protected areas. CPAWS NB believes that wilderness and nature are important to our well-being, as well as culture and the future existence of our communities here in the province. We work with governments at all levels, community groups, and concerned citizens to try to find solutions to nature conservation challenges. We believe that the health of our communities is really tied to the health of the natural world around us. And this is becoming more and more evident as we start to see the effects of climate change. So scientists are telling us what we can expect to see from climate change over the coming decades. More flooding, storm surges and droughts, more fires, new insects and tree diseases. Essentially, we will be dealing with environmental conditions that are less predictable and more uncomfortable. And we may get to the point that some places, even here in New Brunswick, become unlivable. From flood control to shading our communities, as well as from providing pollinators for our food supply, to resources like timber and fish, we are intricately tied to the natural world around us. And we need these ecological services to be intact or to be restored so we can respond well and adapt to climate change. So essentially what we're facing is this dual crisis, the biodiversity loss and climate change. And as the slide said, it's here in New Brunswick, it's not just global. And what we know is that habitat loss and fragmentation from human activities are causing a rapid decline of biodiversity, resulting in this nature emergency that we're experiencing. All the while, climate change is growing in significance. So we can't wait to take serious action. We have to act now. To ensure nature and people thrive in the future, we think that much more land and ocean need to be protected today. We can't afford to wait another moment to make change. We can no longer rely on environmental impact assessments to decide and if an important wetland will be replaced by development or not. Or hope that our natural resource management techniques will be enough. Evidence shows they are not. To reverse biodiversity loss and to help fight climate change, more protected areas in all forms need to be created. They are really what we have so far as a baseline insurance policy against the unpredictability and risks we face with climate impacts. And so on that note, I'll pass it over to Roberta.
Thanks, Mel. So there are all kinds of scientific studies that have been done around the world that show that protected areas are very effective and one of the most effective tools we have to conserve intact nature. And we also know that protected areas can play an important role in both mitigating and adapting or responding to climate change. Excuse me. One of the things that the scientific studies are telling us is that we know protected areas cannot be expected to do the whole job all by themselves, and that we do need them to be well connected, and the areas around them need to be well managed to allow movement of ecological processes and wildlife across the landscape. So the main things that come out of a lot of these studies that are showing the effectiveness of protected areas are that they actually enhance both the robustness and the resilience of the natural systems around us. And there's a need in New Brunswick for us to have protected areas all throughout the province, because each community needs to be able to benefit from that resilience and robustness and all of the benefits that we receive from nature. Next slide now.
There we go.
So it's becoming more and more recognized in Canada that nature is part of the climate solution, and more work is going on all across the country. We really do need to push forward faster on providing a greater emphasis on the specific role of protected areas as part of a climate solution. So it's not only just about managing trees, it's not only about how we manage our natural resources that we use from nature, it's also about making sure that we're protecting those intact ecosystems that are going to be providing the best insurance policy against climate change impacts. And so, oh, sorry, go back. Some of the benefits that intact nature actually can provide is better storage of carbon, making sure that ecosystems are not only absorbing carbon, but making sure that carbon is not being released from all of those ecosystems into the atmosphere. And so those are some of the long-term assurances that we see as a result of protected areas on land and sea. Next. So it's really important that any nature-based climate solutions have to happen in the context of recognition of the rights and title of Indigenous peoples, respect for Indigenous knowledge, and the assurances that Indigenous people have a dominant role in land use decisions and ocean use decisions in their territories. Respecting the sovereignty and leadership of Indigenous nations and supporting Indigenous-led conservation is really important and will go a long way towards ensuring a future for nature, both on land and in the sea. And studies internationally of Indigenous-led conservation and Indigenous protected and conserved areas are showing that they do have significant benefits for nature and positive outcomes. So it's really important that we continue investing, that governments continue investing in supporting Indigenous-led conservation. And we think it's really important that our provincial government in New Brunswick also develops positive partnerships with Indigenous-led conservation projects here. So a key principle of conservation biology is the idea of having networks of protected areas. And so these are protected areas where there's attention being paid to what happens amongst the protected areas on the landscape, and that there is room to move for ecological processes like seed dispersal, and also for the movement of wildlife amongst these refuges of nature. Next. And we're learning more and more about the specific kinds of habitats that are considered to be climate superheroes. These are habitats that are doing an extra special job of either absorbing carbon from the atmosphere or making sure that it's stored in the nature that they hold within them. And some of these are headwater forests and streams, riparian habitats and old forests, bogs, salt marshes, eelgrass beds, and the ocean itself. So just zooming in to some of those, for example, old and intact forests and rivers are really important for all kinds of co-benefits that we get from their existence and their intactness, such as cleaning the air and filtering the air, making sure we have clean and abundant water supplies, and absorbing and storing carbon. Now, one of the things that we're finding through research is that old forest in particular, with plenty of rich soil that includes a lot of fungi and insects and key levels of biodiversity, are carbon storage powerhouses on the landscape in Canada and in New Brunswick. Also, all of these ecosystems are really important for providing flood control and natural cooling to our communities. So we need to do a better job of protecting them throughout the province. Coastal marshes and eelgrass beds are climate superheroes because of the enormous amount of carbon storage ability they have. And studies have shown that they are some of the most carbon dense ecosystems on Earth. And so they are storing an enormous amount of carbon compared to other ecosystems. And one of the things that we're learning as well is that coastal and marine protected areas are really important to reducing the impacts of climate change on our communities and on the Earth. And they help to reduce ocean acidification, They help to protect us and absorb the power from sea level rise. And they help to prevent or ameliorate the shifts in species that are happening as a result of the warming of the oceans, so that more species can find the food they need in the places that they end up. Next. So we know that protected areas help keep nature intact, robust, and resilient. And these are all really important features. The more we lessen the threats we're throwing at nature from all sides, the better chance it will have to heal itself and help protect our life support systems. And so protected areas on land and sea protect from a lot of these intensive use of resources, drilling, paving, building, clear cutting. And these are all activities that weaken nature's strength and resilience, thus the importance of protected areas on both land and sea. So what needs to happen next in New Brunswick if we're going to actually do a good job of preparing the way and absorbing the impacts of climate change is that we need to go beyond the 10% of New Brunswick that's currently in protected areas. And globally, science is telling us, and the scientists around the world are telling us, that we need close to 50% for nature globally to protect our life support systems. And if we take better care with nature all throughout New Brunswick, it can help protect our communities from the uncertainties and risks of climate change, that insurance policy that Mel referred to earlier. And even if it might be hard to get to even 30%, which is Canada's goal here in New Brunswick, we need to do better than we are. We need to keep striving with bold commitments, bold targets, and try to get there as much as we possibly can and do what we can to support governments in getting there. Next. So the way we can support governments to get there is that we need way more people to be speaking up in support of strong protected areas on land and sea. Because the New Brunswick government is only going to do this work and be bold and create bold targets for protected areas in New Brunswick as part of our climate change action plan if everyone uses their voice, their influence, the connections they have in communities, and provide that motivation and hope for people that if they speak up, it will make a difference. We have a whole Speak Up for Nature section on our website at cpausnb.org. And we would also be really happy to come and speak with your group or your club or any collection of people that you can pull together about how you can do this in your own community. So we have 3 key takeaways that we would like to leave you with. The importance of protecting areas to help to reverse biodiversity loss and help fight climate change. We really need to have more of those intact ecosystems being protected on land and in the ocean around New Brunswick. The second is that these areas need to be connected with well-managed lands and waters amongst the protected areas. So we can't give up on all of those other management tools that we need to use for the areas that we are using more often and intervening with to access resources. And the third is the importance of respecting the sovereignty and leadership of Indigenous nations and supporting Indigenous-led conservation as we go forward with all of this work. Hand it back to you, Mel.
Thanks so much, Roberta, and for everyone for listening. If you're interested in learning more about our organization or becoming a member or supporting our work, feel free to check out our website. It's listed there, cpausnb.org. And feel free to go to our social media. We're on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. And now I'll hand it over back to Lily. And we're here and we're happy to answer any questions you may have about our presentation.
In fact, we want to answer questions.
Exactly.
That's why we've left plenty of time for questions and answers, because we told you what we wanted to tell you about, but we want to hear what you want to learn about, and we want to hear from you and listen.
Wonderful. Thank you both so much for your wonderful presentation. I know I learned a lot, and I'm excited to see, what other participants would like to discuss further. So if you have any questions, feel free to write them in the chat, or you can raise your virtual hand or physical hand if you have your video on, and I'll call on you. So si vous voulez poser des questions, vous pouvez mettre
If you'd
dans
like to ask a question, you can put it in the chat or raise your hand, your virtual hand. You can ask questions in English or in French.
Yeah, I see one hand that was raised by Tim. So if you want to unmute and ask your question, go ahead.
Thanks for the presentation. I just had a question concerning you mentioned, forming a network of areas that are protected, naturally protected, and joining them by natural corridors so they can work together. I'm just curious about, from your experience, who forms the natural corridors? Is it the community? Is it the government? Have you an example of a natural corridor between two protected areas?
And there are lots of examples in our region of specifically governments and communities coming together to specifically make sure that there are safe havens for wildlife amongst protected areas. And there's a lot of work that's going on in New England, for example, in Vermont, where government, a lot of the land is privately owned. And so governments have to work with private landowners and communities and municipalities, towns and villages, to try and piece together some safe corridors that would allow wildlife to move across the landscape. There are also some good examples in southern Quebec, in the Appalachian Corridor region, where they've been deliberately going to communities and talking to them about the importance of specific areas that would help to connect protected areas or nature reserves that exist in their region. So we have good examples from lots of places. We're working in a couple of parts of New Brunswick as CPAWS with other partners in the northwestern part of New Brunswick, and what we call the Three Borders region, where New Brunswick, Quebec, and Maine all meet to explore the opportunities for how this can be done in that part of the world. And we also are working on the Chignecto Isthmus with a lot of partners, where there's mainly on New Brunswick side, mainly privately owned land. So it's a big partnership that we're all going to need to be getting together of protecting what you might call stepping stones of habitat that would allow wildlife to find safe refuge and also avoid danger zones like roads, if possible. So those are some examples that we do have within the region that we can learn from. But of course, in New Brunswick, there's a lot of crown land. And if we manage it appropriately, it can be acting as part of that kind of connection amongst protected areas, as long as we're not fragmenting the ecosystems too much with more roads and more permanent roads, more pavement, more developments, more built developments. Mel, did you have anything to add?
I think maybe it's just to add is that a good example of working towards creating these corridors is how in this last round of protected areas that the provincial government in New Brunswick just recently created, they did try to look at the already existing protected areas and build upon those. So adding more hectares or acres that are protected in a given area, to sort of work towards that corridor or mosaic approach.
So would they be mapped anywhere? How would people know that there would be a corridor between two protected areas? How would the regular public know?
I mean, not here in New Brunswick. We don't have any maps that show corridors because they haven't been officially designated as a corridor. It's more a function that they provide on the landscape as opposed to a map that shows exactly what's happening there. But in other parts in Vermont and other places, they do have maps that show how they're piecing together corridors in some of those other places that I mentioned.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Tim, for starting us off with the questions. Next, we have a question that's been posed in the chat from Kate. Can you recommend any particular studies that illustrate the carbon storage potential of old growth forests?
Not off the top of my head. Happy to follow up with you and go through my files and see what I have to offer, but not off the top of my head.
As I see Christine, you have your hand up. Go ahead.
Yeah, on that note, and I'd have to look it up. I was just recently at a conference called the Eastern Old Growth Conference, and Mark Anderson of TNC presented some work about this, that he's it's new
Great.
work that he's bringing out. So I can find that information and send it to someone to share with everyone.
That's a great idea. Yeah, Christine, you can send it to me and I can share it with anybody here who's interested in that. That's great.
Great. Yeah, it was exciting new work.
Yeah, there's a lot of very interesting work going on about climate resilient ecosystems and climate resilient nature from the Nature Conservancy in the US. And they have a lot of really knowledgeable scientists on that topic. So that's often a place I go first as well.
All right, we have another question in the chat, and then we'll move to Diane, who has her hand raised. Are you aware of any maps of the remaining Wabanaki/old growth forests in New Brunswick?
No. All right. That'd be great if there were. We have maps that show old forest habitats that are on Crown land that the Department of Natural Resources has identified as being important, and that they manage them to maintain their old forest character to the mature forest character to the extent that they can. Those are the main maps that I would know about. There are different private organizations. Nature Conservancy of Canada does some research on this, so they may have some information about areas that they've looked at, and also the Nature Trust of New Brunswick, but I'm not aware of any maps. Anybody else?
Never mind.
Hello.
Diane, you have a question. Would you feel free to unmute it? Oh, you are unmuted. So go ahead.
Thank you, Lily, and thank you. The workshop is very interesting and leads me to another question, which is peatlands protection or conservation of peatlands as separate from old growth. Where my interest is in the southeastern New Brunswick, and I know there is a significant peat bog being exploited not too far from the community of near Shediac, very close. And I've never heard that there was any, that the province has any concern over maintaining and protecting peatlands. What I've read is that they're critical because they can release lots of methane.
Yes.
So I'm curious about what could be what community members and citizens could do to raise the awareness about that. That's one question. My other question would be saltwater marshes. And I'm aware of the Dieppe project, the Lawrence Street one in Sackville, very good projects. And I think that by the coast, we don't tend to think about projects like that because we have a strand of beach that protects us to a great degree, but doesn't completely. And so my other interest is that saltwater marshland. What work has been done in that area.
Mm-hmm. So CPAWS New Brunswick nominated a number of intact peat bogs for protection in this last round when the provincial government was doing their protected areas program to reach 10%. And some of them were protected on Crown land. However, there is a significant peat mining sector in New Brunswick, and there are a lot of the peat bogs are either already in the process of being mined for their peat, or will be, or are on the books to be mined for their peat. And this is an ongoing conversation we've been having with the provincial government to encourage them to, I mean, in my view, I think they should all be protected from peat mining. It may take us a while to get to that point because it is an industry that is already exists in the province, and that there are contracts and other things that prevent the government from just canceling everything. But it does need to be something that the province takes more seriously, is including more of these in protected areas, and not having all of them be on the books, or most of them be on the books for future peat mining or current peat mining for that matter. So it is a big issue, and we're going to be delving into it a bit more deeply over the next year to see if we can't get some better policies about that. Salt marshes, right now, all coastal salt marshes are considered to be, as my understanding, provincially significant wetlands. And so we should be actually making sure that they are not being drained or developed or built upon or covered over, or in otherwise removing the important function that they're providing. And so there's more attention that needs to be put on that as well. So if you wanted to connect with us, Diane, you could send us an email, you could put something in the chat, and we can follow up with you, and or just communicate with us through the website if you need to. Because I do think this is important, and we need more members of communities talking about this, and with the people who are making decisions about where development happens and when it happens.
Thank you very much.
And just to add on the peat and the bog file, something that consumers can do is, if you are a gardener and you're going to your local gardening shop in the spring to get planting mix, you can make sure that it doesn't have peat in it. And if you can't find a bag that doesn't, you can ask the store that they stock them, and the more people that request that, then they'll make sure that they have potting soil that doesn't have peat. And it is something that's much further advanced in the UK, with a lot more campaigns and a lot more options for people that are gardeners or farmers and looking for those options. But I think we can take inspiration from that and start that here as well in Atlantic Canada.
Great, thank you. We have another question in the chat, which is from Caleb. Do we know if any of the latest batch of protected areas in New Brunswick were selected in whole or in part for reasons related to climate resilience or refugia? Is this factoring into decisions being made regarding site selection in New Brunswick, or just afterthoughts or co-benefits?
It was definitely one of the criteria that the provincial government used when they were looking for areas to be nominated as protected areas, as potential protected areas. So climate refugia, the idea of areas that are helping to build climate resilience was one of the key characteristics, one of the key criteria they used to select areas for protection, amongst others, obviously important wildlife habitat, species at risk, areas that were important for outdoor education or other features, but definitely that was a key consideration.
Great, thank you. Are there any other questions? I'm not seeing any in the chat or any hands raised, but feel free to jump in. We still have lots of time.
And it looks like Christine just put the link to that report that we were talking about earlier in the chat, if anyone is interested in checking that out.
Great. I see we have a hand up. So Juan, if you would like to jump in, feel free.
Yes, thank you. Hi, Roberta. Nice, nice to see
Hi.
you. I'm wondering, what is your sense of the New Brunswick provincial government appetite for reaching goals such as 30 by 30 or 50 by 50? Do you think they're there yet, or will it take a little bit more convincing for them to fully embrace such a vision?
I think it's going to take more convincing. I know that there is a commitment on the table, and the provincial government wants to set a new target to do more protected areas. It is going to take more convincing, I think. More people need to speak out. And I can't emphasize enough how important it is for people to speak up to provincial government representatives, also to even local representatives who may occasionally be resistant to the idea of protected areas or may be worried about impacts on natural resource industries and the natural resource sector. So we need decision makers at all levels to be hearing from their constituents, the voters and the citizens, that this is an important piece of making sure that we're in the best position we can be in to respond to climate change impacts. And if communities are worried about flooding, if communities are worried about heat stress or droughts, and any of the other impending predicted impacts related to climate change, we need to take this seriously and make some bold moves. And it is going to require a lot of decision makers to have the guts to do something big. And the way they can do that is if they know that there are enough supporters behind them in their communities, they don't feel that it's a big risk for them to do that, and that they are actually be able to say, I'm listening to the people, this is what they want. There are a lot of people, I could go on about this for a long time, as you can imagine, but there are a lot of people in communities whose jobs it makes it hard for them to speak up. It makes it difficult. They don't want to be seen as the person, the outlier in their community who's going on about protecting nature when everybody is so worried about their jobs. We need to have more people being able to make the link between nature and jobs. Protecting nature does provide jobs on the landscape and supports existing jobs. So making those links, but also if you are in a position where you can speak out, it's so important that you do it. And we're trying to provide the motivation and provide people with the information that will allow them to do it with confidence. And so they go into a room, or they write a letter, or they get a meeting with somebody who's a decision maker or a politician, then they feel confident in what they're bringing to the table and that they have the answers that the decision makers need.
And I just put a link in the chat to our Speak Up for Nature toolkit. So please feel free to check that out after the webinar.
Thank you very much.
And thank you for the question. And I see we have a hand raised from Christine. If you would like to unmute and ask your question, go ahead.
Thank you, Christine Laporte with Wildlands Network as well. I'm wondering if in your and any of the participants' experience, the voices of the Indigenous-led efforts, how do they weigh in with the provincial government? Is it as powerful or more powerful than the settler community? Like how do you see those, I guess, politics working? And what are some of the capacity gaps there?
I would say that there's a lot more work that needs to be done in the relationship building realm between the provincial government and the Indigenous nations. And there needs to be a lot more trust built among them. And I think there's a willingness amongst the people that I know who work in different government departments. There's an extreme willingness and they really want to do what's right with Indigenous people and with Indigenous-led conservation, and they want to support it. I would say that there are challenges at the top levels of governments, sometimes with Indigenous nations and the relationship that exists there. There's not an awful lot of trust. It's hard for people who are, you know, the biologists and the ecologists and the protected areas planners to be able to come in and do the job that they want to do if the trust isn't there. And so I think the trust needs to be built all the way through governments, and for that to really be able to work as it needs to.
Perfect. Are there any other questions that are coming up for folks? Well, I have a question before we finish off for the day. I'm curious, like the work that I do coordinating for the NBN is working a lot with municipalities on building capacity around nature-based climate solutions. A lot of the efforts that you've talked about today are focused on like building protected areas at the provincial level and with provincial lands. I'm curious, like, are there things that municipalities can do
Yes.
to help increase protected areas in the province and combine that with their work to adapt and mitigate climate change?
Yeah, of course. Most municipalities have within their purview the ability to designate green spaces and blue spaces, and they should do so. And so it should be a key part of all municipal planning that they make sure that they're protecting those important ecosystems like the ones I mentioned earlier, the riparian habitats, the wetlands of all types, salt marshes in particular, peat bogs, old forests, or at least older forests, intact forests of some type. They're all going to be really important to municipalities because we can't just focus on protecting areas that are far away from communities. Not in New Brunswick, that's not very many places are far away from communities, but it's not only Crown land that we need to be focusing on, or even in the open ocean. It's coastal areas, it's places where people live. That's where we achieve the benefits of protecting nature, is for resilience to climate change, is making sure that that robust nature is around us, is all around us. And that means in communities as well as around communities. And so municipalities can do that, what is in their purview. And they can also be talking to the provincial government about protecting all of the drinking water supply areas that provide drinking water to all the communities. So these are all things that need to happen. And municipalities have a voice in making that change. Sometimes it's directly, and sometimes they're influencing what's happening at a provincial level.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Thank you. Are there any other questions from folks here today? Well, with that, I think we'll conclude this webinar. I want to thank both Roberta and Melanie so much for coming and sharing their knowledge and the context for protected areas in New Brunswick in relation to adapting to and mitigating climate change. It's been really wonderful to learn more about protected areas. And I want to thank everyone, all the participants here, for joining us on your lunch hour and for bringing up lots of really wonderful questions. This is the last webinar in this series. However, here at the New Brunswick Environmental Network, we will be hosting our annual Climate Change Adaptation Collaborative Conference on December 6th in Fredericton, although it will be hybrid, so you can attend virtually as well, which is looking at the co-benefits of adaptation measures to adapt to climate change. So highly recommend that you stay in touch with us here at the NBEN as well as CPAWS NB for future events and opportunities to be involved. So thank you so much again for being here, and feel free to reach out to myself or the NBN team at nbn.ca, as well as you can follow up with the CPAWS NB team if you have further questions or interest.